This is Mr. Oscar, and today we will talk about a pattern that I believe is one of the most quietly devastating experiences a capable person can live through repeatedly, not the failure that comes from never starting, not the collapse that comes from poor planning or bad timing or circumstances outside your control. The stop, the specific, inexplicable, almost ritual stopping that happens not at the beginning of the work, not even in the middle, but right at the edge of completion, right when the finish line is close enough to see. Right when everything that was supposed to make crossing it feel inevitable somehow makes stopping feel more compelling than continuing. If you have lived this, and I suspect you have, or you would not still be reading, you know exactly what I mean. The project that gets to 90% and sits there for weeks. The goal that gets close enough to taste and then quietly gets replaced by a new goal that is safely back at the beginning. The relationship, the career move, the creative work, the business, approached, built, almost finished, and then abandoned at precisely the moment completion would have changed everything. And the most painful part is not the incompletion itself, it is the pattern. The fact that it happens not once but repeatedly. That the stopping point is always approximately the same distance from the finish line. That some part of you knows, with a recognition that sits in the stomach rather than the mind, that this is not bad luck. This is you. Today we are going to understand exactly why, and more importantly, we are going to build the specific, practical, research-grounded response that makes crossing the finish line finally possible. I want to tell you about a business proposal I worked on in 2014. Not the first proposal I had ever written, not even close. I had written dozens over the course of my career. I knew how to do it. I had done the research, gathered the data, and structured the argument. By every objective measure, the proposal was strong. My business partner at the time, a careful, precise woman named Catherine who did not give compliments casually, told me it was the best work I had produced since we had begun working together. It was 95% complete. One section left, a financial summary that would have taken perhaps 2 hours to finish. I did not finish it for 3 weeks. Not because I was busy with more important things, not because I lacked the information, not because the remaining section was technically difficult. I stared at that document every single day for 3 weeks. I opened it. I read through what was already there. I told myself today was the day, and then I closed it and did something else. Catherine eventually asked me directly what was happening, and I gave her the kind of answer people give when they do not yet have the real one. Something about wanting to make sure it was perfect before submitting, something about timing, something that sounded plausible and explained almost nothing. What I could not tell her, because I did not yet have the language for it, was what I felt every time I opened that document and faced the final section. Something that was not quite fear, not quite resistance, a specific kind of heaviness that arrived at exactly the point where finishing became real, where the proposal stopped being a project I was working on and became a thing I was actually submitting to the judgment of the world. As long as it was unfinished, it was still mine, still protected, still capable of being whatever I needed it to be in my imagination. The moment I finished it, the moment I clicked send, all of that protection dissolved, and what was left was a real thing. In the real world, being evaluated by real people who might find it insufficient. The finishing was not the hard part. The exposure that came with finishing was. I did not have that clarity in 2014. I found it later, in the research that explained everything. The psychological architecture of stopping before the finish line is documented across several distinct bodies of research. And what is striking, when you look at all of it together, is that the stopping is not random, and it is not weakness. It is the activation of a specific set of psychological protection mechanisms at precisely the moment they are most strongly triggered. The first and most foundational explanation comes from Dr. Gay Hendricks at the University of Santa Clara, whose concept of the upper limit problem I introduced in the self-sabotage conversation on this channel. Hendricks found through decades of clinical and research work that every person carries an internal thermostat, a set point for how much success, visibility, achievement, and positive outcome they will allow themselves to experience before activating a self-limiting behavior that brings the temperature back down. And the critical finding, the one that explains the specific geography of the stopping, is that the upper limit problem does not activate at the beginning of a project. It activates at the point of breakthrough, at the moment when completion would produce a real, irreversible, identity-changing outcome. Because that is when the thermostat registers that the temperature has exceeded the set point, not when the work is hard, when the work is almost done and the consequence of finishing has become concrete enough to feel real. The stopping before the finish line is not procrastination in the conventional sense. It is the thermostat correcting. It is the psyche pulling the temperature back to the level it has been calibrated to tolerate. The second explanation comes from the research of Dr. Rosabeth Moss Kanter, the professor at Harvard Business School whose work on organizational change produced what she calls Kanter's Law. The law states simply, everything looks like failure in the middle. Kanter's research found that the most dangerous point in any significant project or change initiative is not the beginning and not the end. It is the final stretch, the period between the visible early momentum and the achieved outcome, where progress becomes hardest to see, resistance is highest, and the temptation to abandon is strongest. She identified a specific psychological dynamic she calls the valley of despair, the period just before completion, where the initial excitement has completely faded, the end is not yet close enough to produce its own motivational pull, and the accumulated cost of the effort is at its highest. This is the zone where most people stop. Not because the work has become objectively harder, because the motivational landscape has temporarily inverted. The cost of continuing feels higher than the cost of stopping, at the precise moment when stopping is most destructive. Kanter's research shows that leaders and individuals who complete large, difficult projects are not people who never experience the valley of despair. They are people who have developed, through experience or through deliberate preparation, the expectation that the valley exists and the specific structural responses that carry them through it before the motivational landscape corrects itself on the other side. The third explanation draws from the research of Dr. Bluma Zygarnik, the Soviet psychologist whose landmark work in the 1920s identified what became known as the Zygarnik effect, the finding that the human brain maintains an active, unresolved cognitive representation of uncompleted tasks that produces a persistent low-level psychological tension until the task is either completed or explicitly abandoned. Zygarnik's research showed that this tension, which operates largely outside conscious awareness, has a paradoxical effect on behavior near the completion point of a significant task. As completion approaches, and the cognitive representation of the unfinished task becomes more vivid and more pressing, the psychological cost of the unresolved tension increases. And for people whose relationship with completion carries anxiety, whose experience of finishing is associated with exposure, judgment, or the loss of the protected potential of the unfinished state, this increased tension activates the avoidance response at precisely the moment when completion is closest. In plain language, the closer you get to finishing, the louder the unfinished thing gets in your nervous system. And if finishing has historically felt threatening rather than relieving, that increased volume triggers the stop response rather than the completion response. There is also critical research here from Dr. Carol Dweck, whose fixed mindset findings apply with particular precision to the finish line problem. Dweck found that people with a fixed performance identity, people whose sense of self is significantly tied to the quality of what they produce, experience the moment of completion as a moment of permanent verdict. Before the work is finished, it exists in a state of protected potential. It could still be extraordinary. The finishing destroys that protection and submits the person, through their work, to an assessment that cannot be undone. The stopping before the finish line is, in many cases, the fixed mindset's final and most elegant protection. It preserves the possibility of excellence by preventing the submission to the reality test that would determine whether that excellence is actual. And finally, the neuroscience. Dr. Kent Berridge at the University of Michigan, whose research on the distinction between wanting and liking in the brain's reward system, found something that directly explains the motivational collapse that occurs near completion. Berridge identified that the dopamine system, contrary to what most people assume, is not primarily a pleasure system. It is a wanting system. It drives the pursuit of reward rather than the enjoyment of it. And his research showed that dopamine activity is highest at the beginning of a pursuit, when the reward is anticipated but not yet close, and drops significantly as the reward becomes imminent. What this means for the finish line problem is neurologically precise. The motivational energy generated by dopamine-driven pursuit is designed to get you into the work and sustain you through the middle of it. But as completion approaches and the anticipation resolves into near certainty, the dopamine drive actually reduces. The wanting system has nearly done its job. And if the person has not built alternative motivational structures to carry them through the final stretch, structures that do not depend on the dopamine of pursuit, the motivational gap near the finish line is real, neurological, and predictable. Here is the practical framework, built specifically for the finish line problem, not generic completion advice, but a structure that directly addresses each of the mechanisms the research identifies. The first intervention addresses Hendrix's upper limit problem. the thermostat that activates at the point of breakthrough. And it requires doing something that feels almost counterintuitively administrative at a moment that feels like it should be purely psychological. Before you enter the final stretch of any significant project, define the finish line in writing with absolute precision. Not approximately done, not pretty much complete, the exact, specific, unambiguous criteria that constitute completion. One sentence, written down. The reason this matters is that the upper limit problem activates most powerfully in the ambiguity of near completion, where the thermostat can always find a reason why it is not quite time to finish yet. One more revision, one more check, one more improvement that keeps completion perpetually just out of reach. A precisely defined finish line removes the ambiguity that the upper limit problem needs to operate. There is no room for the thermostat to move the goalposts when the goalposts are already fixed in writing before the final stretch begins. The second intervention addresses Kanter's Valley of Despair, the motivational collapse in the final stretch before completion, and it draws from the implementation intention research of Peter Gollwitzer applied specifically to the pre-completion period. Before you enter the final stretch, write one if-then statement that specifically anticipates the motivational valley. If I reach the point where continuing feels harder than stopping, and the end no longer feels worth the remaining effort, then I will do only the next smallest completable component and nothing else before assessing whether to continue. This pre-written response does two things simultaneously. It normalizes the valley. It tells your nervous system in advance that the motivational collapse is expected and not a signal to stop, and it reduces the size of the required action to the point where continuing is easier than stopping, even in the depleted motivational state of the valley. The third intervention addresses the Zeigarnik tension and the Dweck verdict anxiety simultaneously. It is what I call a pre-completion reframe, written in the 24 hours before the final work session that will produce completion. Write one paragraph, honestly, not aspirationally, that answers this question. If this work is received as insufficient, if it falls short of what I hoped it would be, what will I do next? Not what will I feel. What will I do? This is not pessimism. It is the construction of a survivable post-completion narrative that reduces the existential weight of the verdict. Dweck's research shows that the fixed mindset's avoidance of completion is driven by the absence of a viable response to imperfection. When the person cannot imagine a constructive path through an insufficient outcome, when the verdict feels terminal rather than informational, the protection of incompletion becomes worth the cost of stopping. Give yourself a specific, concrete, actionable response to the worst plausible outcome, and the verdict loses most of its power to stop you before it arrives. The fourth intervention addresses Barrage's neurological finding about the dopamine drop near completion, and it requires building a specific external reward, something genuinely pleasurable and meaningful, that is attached exclusively to the act of completion rather than to the pursuit of the goal. Not a reward for doing good work, not a reward for progress. A reward that exists only on the other side of the specific defined finish line. Something real enough that the wanting system, which has been driving the pursuit, transfers some of its motivational energy to the completion reward as the pursuit reward fades. Skinner's reinforcement research, which I have covered on this channel, is explicit about the power of anticipated reward in sustaining behavior through the final stretch of a difficult task. The reward must be defined before the final stretch begins. It must be specific, and it must be genuinely desired, not a token gesture, but something that the nervous system actually wants enough to keep moving toward. I want to close with Catherine. She finished the proposal herself, filed it without my final section, won a version of the contract on the strength of what was already there. She never said anything unkind about it. But the look she gave me when she told me, quiet, measured, more sad than angry, is something I have carried with me ever since, not as punishment, as information. Because in that moment, I understood something I had been circling for years without landing on directly. The finish line is not where the risk is highest. It is where the protection is lowest. And every time I had stopped before it, every time I had let the work sit at 95% while the window closed, I had chosen the protection of the unfinished over the possibility of the completed, and the unfinished never became anything. The protected potential never materialized into actual outcome. The thermostat kept the temperature exactly where it had always been. Completion is not the end of the possibility. It is the beginning of the actual. And the actual, imperfect, exposed, subject to the judgment of reality, is the only version of your work that ever changes anything. The finish line is not a threat. It is the only place where the work becomes real. Cross it. I'm Mr. Oscar. This is Execution Psychology, and I will see you in the next one.